A cop pulls over a teenage girl for reckless driving, but the moment he sees her face, his heart stops. She looks exactly like his daughter who died 5 years ago. But that's not all. As he searches her bag, he finds something that chills him to the core, a ring. Not just any ring, it's the exact one he buried with his daughter. Who is this girl? How did she get that ring? And what secrets is she hiding? This story will take you on a journey of grief, mystery, and redemption, where nothing is as it seems. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted long shadows across Highway 23 as Deputy Sheriff Clint Walker guided his patrol car along the empty stretch of road. The clock on his dashboard read 7 a.m., marking the start of another shift. His eyes drifted to the small photo taped beside the speedometer, a smiling teenage girl with bright eyes and auburn hair, her braces catching the light in her wide grin. The edges of the photo had grown soft from countless touches, like a worry stone worn smooth by years of handling. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered as he did every day, his finger brushing against the worn edge of the photo. 5 years hadn't made it any easier. The quiet moments like these always brought Natalie's memory flooding back, along with the weight of everything left unsaid. Some days the memories felt like a physical presence sitting beside him in the passenger seat. Clint blinked hard and focused on the road ahead, his hands tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. The highway stretched out before him, peaceful and still in the early spring light. A few wildflowers had started blooming along the shoulder, adding spots of yellow and purple to the green grass. The morning dew still clung to the plants, sparkling like tiny diamonds in the sunlight. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of fresh grass through his partially open window. A flash of movement caught his attention. A blue sedan came barreling around the bend ahead, weaving erratically across the center line. The car nearly clipped an oncoming pickup truck as it approached the intersection at Duncan Road, causing the truck driver to blast his horn and swerve sharply. The truck's tires kicked up dust from the shoulder as it barely avoided collision. Clint's training kicked in. He flipped on his lights and siren, pulling out to pursue the reckless driver. The sedan continued for several seconds, wobbling slightly, before finally slowing and pulling onto the shoulder in a spray of loose gravel. The car's exhaust rattled, suggesting it was on its last legs. Following procedure, Clint approached the driver's side carefully, his right hand resting near his hip as he scanned for any signs of trouble. Through the window, he could see a young woman gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. She couldn't have been more than 17, wearing a wrinkled fast food uniform and radiating nervous energy. Her name tag was crooked, and dark circles under her eyes hinted at exhaustion. "License and registration, please," he said, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the familiar ache that always came with stopping teenage drivers. The morning sun cast his shadow across her door. The girl turned to face him, and Clint felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Though her skin was several shades darker than Natalie's, something in her features, the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw, even the way she tilted her head defiantly, sent a jolt of recognition through him that made his chest tighten. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. "I'm Claire Robinson," she said, her voice carrying a defensive edge that spoke of too many hard lessons learned too young. "I was just running late for work, that's all." Her words came out quick and practiced, like she'd explained herself to authority figures many times before. Clint struggled to maintain his composure, fighting back the ghost of memory. "I still need to see your ID and insurance, miss." He worked to keep his voice from wavering. Claire wouldn't meet his eyes as she dug through her bag, a worn backpack that had seen better days. The zipper was broken, held together with safety pins, and several patches covered obvious tears. Papers rustled as she searched, and something metallic caught the morning light. A small ring tumbled out onto the seat beside her, landing with a soft ping against the worn upholstery. Clint's world tilted sideways. The ring was silver, with a distinctive pattern of 3 intertwined hearts, exactly like the one they'd buried with Natalie. He'd chosen it himself, remembering how she'd admired it in the jewelry store window just weeks before the accident. her face pressed against the glass like a much younger child. The memory of that day was so vivid, it made his throat close up. His hand trembled as he pointed to it, his voice barely more than a whisper. That ring. The words felt thick in his mouth, like honey crystallized by time. Claire's eyes widened and her body tensed like a cornered animal. She instinctively covered the ring with her hand, as if protecting something precious. The morning suddenly felt very still, the only sound the quiet idling of both engines and the distant call of a meadowlark. A cool breeze stirred her dark hair, carrying with it the scent of spring grass and recent rain. Clint stood frozen, staring at the impossible ring, while his mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. Every bit of his training told him to stay professional, but all he could think about was Natalie's identical ring, buried deep in the earth with his little girl, and the crushing weight of questions that now pressed against his chest. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for one of them to break the silence that had settled between them like a physical thing. The ring glinted in the morning sunlight as Clint held it between his trembling fingers. His throat felt tight, memories of Natalie threatening to overwhelm him. The weight of it in his palm felt exactly as he remembered, light yet somehow heavy with significance. He turned to Claire, who stood rigid by her car door, her eyes fixed on the jewelry, her whole body radiating tension. The crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves around them. Where did you get this? His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper, the words catching in his throat. It's mine. Claire crossed her arms, her shoulders tensing as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her worn sneakers scraped against the concrete. I didn't steal it, if that's what you're thinking. A truck rumbled past them on the busy street, the rush of air tousling Claire's dark curls. The familiar smell of exhaust mixed with the crisp morning air, making her wrinkle her nose. Clint's mind raced. The ring was identical, down to the small heart-shaped diamond and the delicate silver vines wrapping around the band. He'd chosen it himself for Natalie's 16th birthday, spent weeks saving up for it, picking up extra shifts just to afford something special. This exact ring was buried with my daughter. His words came out sharper than intended, cutting through the morning air like a knife. So I'm going to ask you again, where did you get it? I told you, it belongs to me. Claire's voice rose, her hands balling into fists at her sides, knuckles turning white. Someone gave it to me, okay? That's all you need to know. Who? When? Clint stepped closer, his police training warring with the storm of emotions in his chest. His heart pounded against his ribs so hard he was sure Claire could hear it. I don't have to tell you that. Claire's eyes darted to the passing cars, then back to Clint, like a cornered animal looking for escape. Her defiance couldn't mask the fear in her expression, the slight quiver in her lower lip. Clint took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The morning air felt thick in his lungs, heavy with tension. Turn around, please. What? Why? Claire's eyes widened, panic creeping into her features as she realized what was coming. I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of theft. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal cold against his palm, each link jingling softly. No, please, I didn't steal anything. Claire's voice cracked with panic. She backed away, drawing curious glances from passing motorists who slowed to watch the scene unfold, their faces pressed against car windows. The ring was a gift, I swear. From who? Clint gently but firmly took her arm, turning her around. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo in his ears, final and damning. You're making a mistake, Claire pleaded as he guided her toward his patrol car. Tears streamed down her face, leaving dark trails on her cheeks, dripping onto her faded t-shirt. I didn't do anything wrong. During the drive to the station, Clint's mind wandered to Natalie's funeral. The ring had been placed on her finger, a final gift she'd take with her. He remembered how the silver had contrasted against her pale skin, how peaceful she'd looked lying there. The memory felt like a physical ache in his chest, a wound that had never properly healed, still raw after all these years. At the station, Clint led Claire to the small interrogation room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her tear-stained face as she sat down, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. Her shoulders hunched forward protectively as she wrapped her arms around herself. He placed the ring on the metal table between them, the soft clink echoing in the silent room like an accusation. "Please," Claire's voice broke as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, her hands trembling where they rested on the table, fingers interlaced tightly. "A woman named Marcia gave me that ring. She helped me when I had nowhere else to go. That's the truth, I promise." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Clint walked into the station early the next morning, the sound mixing with the quiet shuffle of papers and muted phone conversations. The familiar scent of stale coffee and printer ink filled the air. His coffee went untouched, growing cold on his desk while he pulled up Claire's file. The mug had been a Father's Day gift from Natalie, decorated with childish hearts and "World's Best Dad" in wobbly letters, and today its presence felt like another reminder of the strange connection between past and present. His fingers traced the faded paint before he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. In the interrogation room, Claire sat with her shoulders hunched, dark circles under her eyes from a restless night in the holding cell. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she kept tugging at the sleeve of her worn sweater, pulling at a loose thread until it started to unravel. Her defiant gaze met his as he settled into the chair across from her, the metal scraping against the floor in the oppressive silence. "Let's try this again," Clint said, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the growing unease in his gut. "Who gave you the ring?" "I told you. A woman named Marcia." Claire's fingers drummed against the metal table, creating a nervous rhythm that echoed in the small room. The fluorescent light cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. "When exactly did this happen?" Last summer." Claire's eyes darted to the side, focusing on a crack in the wall, her voice growing quieter. "Or maybe it was spring." Clint made a note, his pen scratching against paper. The sound seemed to make Claire more anxious, her shoulders tensing with each stroke. "And where did you meet her?" "Around." Claire shrugged, pulling her sweater tighter around herself like armor. "Does it matter?" The door opened with a loud creak, and Officer Hank Carver strode in, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. The room suddenly felt smaller, more confining. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his badge catching the harsh overhead light, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Having trouble getting a straight answer?" Hank's tone dripped with condescension, each word carefully chosen to wound. No surprise there. These kids from the wrong side of the tracks, especially the... Claire's face hardened as Hank's implications hung in the air, her fingers curling into tight fists against her thighs. She pressed her lips together, her eyes growing distant, retreating to wherever she went to protect herself. A muscle twitched in her jaw. Clint felt his own jaw tighten at Hank's words, but he remained silent, watching Claire withdraw further into herself, hating himself for not speaking up sooner, for letting another person in authority fail her. The quiet stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the constant hum of the lights and Hank's impatient shifting against the wall. Clint shuffled through his papers, aware that his silence made him complicit. Claire now stared at the wall, her earlier willingness to talk completely evaporated, her body language screaming distrust. Her hands had stopped their nervous movement, now lying still and lifeless in her lap. "That'll be all, Hank," Clint finally said. But the damage was done. The words came too late, and they both knew it. The door closed behind Hank with a heavy thud. After several more failed attempts at questions that met with stony silence, Clint gathered his files, his movements slow and defeated. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Would he have treated another teenager this way if they didn't have that ring? If they didn't remind him so much of Natalie? The questions gnawed at him, making his stomach churn with guilt. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing another young person who needed help. In his office, Clint began typing Claire's name into the database, the keyboard clicks echoing his determination. The screen cast a blue glow across his tired face. Something about this whole situation didn't add up, and he was determined to find the truth, not just about the ring, but about Claire herself. His instincts told him there was more to her story than she was letting on. and he owed it to both Claire and himself to discover what that was. Years of police work had taught him to trust his gut, and right now, it was telling him that this girl needed more than just an interrogation. She needed someone to actually listen. Clint's fingers flew across his keyboard, searching through databases and records. Each new detail about Claire's past made his stomach tighten. Multiple foster homes, reports of neglect, and finally, a runaway report filed 6 months ago. The more he read, the more his heart sank at the pattern of instability and hardship that defined her young life. File after file revealed a trail of broken promises and shattered trust. He picked up his phone, dialing the number listed for Claire's last foster family. A woman answered, her voice sharp and impatient, like someone who'd been interrupted during something important. The background noise of a blaring television made her words even harsher. "Mrs. Davis, this is Deputy Walker. I'm calling about Claire Robinson." "That troublemaker?" she scoffed. "What's she done now?" The disdain in her voice was unmistakable, cutting through the phone line like a knife. "I'm trying to understand her situation. Can you tell me why she left?" "Look, Deputy, that girl was nothing but problems. Stealing, lying, staying out all hours. Good riddance, if you ask me." Each accusation came out like a bullet, fired without a moment's hesitation or remorse. Clint's jaw clenched and he had to force himself to keep his voice steady. His free hand curled into a tight fist on his desk. "Did you look for her when she disappeared?" "Why bother? She's probably just running the streets like all the others." The woman's casual dismissal made his blood boil, and the pen he was holding nearly snapped in his grip. After hanging up, Clint rubbed his temples and walked to the holding cells, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Claire sat on the narrow bed, arms wrapped around her knees, making herself as small as possible. Her worn sneakers left dusty marks on the thin mattress. "Your foster mother had some interesting things to say," he said quietly, studying her reaction. He noticed how she flinched at the word, mother. Claire's face hardened, a wall going up behind her eyes. "I bet she did." Her fingers dug into her arms, leaving white marks on her skin. "Want to tell me your side?" "What's the point? Nobody ever believes kids like me anyway." Her words carried the weight of too many disappointments, years of being dismissed and ignored. Clint leaned against the cell bars, trying to appear casual and non-threatening. The metal was cool against his shoulder. "Try me." Claire stayed silent, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, her fingers moving nervously. The thread began to unravel, much like her composure. "Where have you been staying all these months?" he pressed, keeping his tone gentle but firm. "Nowhere," she muttered, then caught herself. "I mean..." Her eyes darted away from his face. "Claire," she sighed, shoulders slumping in defeat. "The Thompsons. They're this old couple who... They've been letting me stay with them. Please don't make me go back to the Davises." The last words came out almost as a whisper, thick with desperation. Clint nodded slowly, processing this new information. "I'll need their address." "You're going to talk to them?" Fear crept into Claire's voice, her fingers gripping her sleeve tighter. A slight tremor ran through her hands. "I need to verify your story." He pulled out his notepad, the pages crinkling in the quiet cell block. "Where can I find them?" Claire hesitated, then quietly gave him the address, each number and street name coming out reluctantly, as if she were betraying a confidence. As Clint gathered his keys and jacket, he glanced back at her cell. Claire watched him through the bars, her expression a mix of worry and resignation. For a moment, she looked so much like Natalie that his chest ached, the familiar pain of loss mixing with a new determination to help this girl. The echo of his footsteps followed him down the corridor, along with the weight of Claire's anxious gaze. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Thompsons' front yard as Clint pulled up to their modest one-story home. Bright marigolds lined a neat garden path, and wind chimes tinkled softly from the covered porch. A worn welcome mat and a pair of gardening gloves by the door spoke of a well-loved home. The scent of blooming jasmine drifted on the breeze as Clint sat in his patrol car for a moment, gathering his thoughts before approaching the door, his fingers drumming absently on the steering wheel. Martha Thompson answered his knock, her silver hair neatly pinned back and kind eyes crinkling with concern when she saw his badge. The smell of fresh-baked cookies wafted from inside, rich with vanilla and chocolate. "Can I help you, officer?" "Deputy Walker, ma'am. I'm here about Claire Robinson." Harold appeared behind his wife, tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses, his weathered hands resting on the doorframe. Deep worry lines creased his forehead. "Please, come in." The living room was cozy and well-worn, filled with family photos and handmade quilts in warm earth tones. A ginger cat dozed in a patch of sunlight near the window, and potted plants dotted every available surface, their leaves casting delicate shadows on the walls. Clint settled into an offered armchair, while Martha brought him a glass of iced tea, condensation already beating on the glass. A family portrait on the side table caught his eye, the Thompsons surrounded by what looked like their children and grandchildren. "Claire's been with us almost a year now," Harold explained, settling onto the sofa beside his wife. His fingers nervously adjusted his glasses, a habit that seemed to surface whenever he was troubled. "Found her sleeping in our garden shed one morning. Poor thing was half-starved, shivering under an old tarp, clutching a backpack like it was her only lifeline." Martha dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling slightly. A half-finished sweater and knitting needles lay in a basket beside her chair. "We couldn't turn her away. She's such a good girl, Deputy. Helps with the dishes, tends the garden. She's just had it rough. Sometimes I hear her crying at night, and it breaks my heart that she won't let me comfort her." "The ring she has," Clint said carefully, watching their reactions. "Can you tell me about it?" Harold nodded, leaning forward. "She found it in one of the donation boxes from the church. We get items regularly through their outreach program, clothes, books, that sort of thing. Claire volunteers to sort through them sometimes. Says it helps her feel useful." "Which church?" Clint asked, pen poised over his notebook, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the growing tension in his shoulders. "Grace Methodist. They work closely with Evergreen Hospice, collecting items from families after—" Martha's voice trailed off, her fingers twisting the tissue into a tight knot. Clint's hand tightened around his pen. Evergreen Hospice, where Natalie had spent her final days. The memories hit him like a physical blow, bringing with them the sterile smell of hospital corridors and the echo of monitors beeping. "Please," Martha leaned forward, her eyes pleading, wrinkles of worry etched deep around her mouth. Her wedding ring caught the light as she clasped her hands together. "Claire's not a bad person. She just needs someone to believe in her, to give her a chance." Harold reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've tried to give her stability, but there's so much she won't talk about. So much pain she carries. Sometimes she reminds me of a wounded bird, wanting to trust but too scared to try. We see her watching us sometimes, like she's waiting for the other shoe to drop." Clint thanked them and stepped outside. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, casting long fingers of light between the trees. A cool evening breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of Martha's flowers. He opened his notebook, staring at the hospice address he'd just written down, his heart heavy with memories he'd tried so hard to forget. The wind chimes sang a melancholy tune behind him as he walked back to his car, each step feeling heavier than the last. The evening shadows lengthened across Clint's living room as he carefully placed a cardboard box on his coffee table. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid, revealing the treasured remnants of Natalie's life. A framed photograph sat on top, Natalie on her 16th birthday, her smile bright and infectious, her long brown hair caught in mid-laugh by the camera. The silver frame had a tiny dent in one corner from the time she'd dropped it while redecorating her room. Clint's thumb traced the edge of the frame, remembering how she'd squealed with delight when he gave her the ring that morning. "Your first piece of real jewelry," he whispered to the empty room, his voice catching. "You wore it every single day after that. Wouldn't even take it off to wash dishes. Mom used to scold you about that." One by one, he removed items from the box, Her favorite purple journal with pressed flowers between its pages, ticket stubs from the Taylor Swift concert they'd attended together, dried corsages from school dances. Each item carried a story, a precious memory that both warmed and wounded his heart. The journal's spine was cracked from constant use, and some pages were wrinkled from tears she'd shed while writing. He paused at a wrinkled movie ticket, remembering how they'd shared a giant bucket of popcorn and laughed until their sides hurt. At the bottom of the box lay a small velvet jewelry box, now empty. The blue fabric was worn smooth in places from years of handling. Clint opened it, running his finger along the indent where her ring had rested, the same ring that now sat in an evidence bag at the station. His chest tightened as the reality of the situation hit him again, making it hard to breathe. "Am I doing the right thing here, sweetheart?" he asked the photograph, searching his daughter's frozen smile for answers. The lamplight caught the glass, creating a soft glow around her face. Maybe I should just let it go. Let the past stay in the past. But as he spoke the words, his mind drifted to Marcia, the hospice nurse who'd shown such kindness during Natalie's final weeks. Her soft voice and gentle hands had brought comfort when nothing else could. He could still picture her gentle smile as she'd adjusted Natalie's pillows or brought her favorite ice chips. Marcia had been there through the worst nights, offering comfort not just to Natalie but to Clint as well, bringing him coffee and making sure he remembered to eat. "The hospice," he murmured, sitting up straighter as clarity cut through his grief. His heart began to race with sudden purpose. Someone there has to know what happened to your ring. Marcia would remember. Reaching for his notepad, Clint wrote, "Call hospice. Ask about Marcia," in bold letters. His handwriting was shaky, but determined. He set it on his nightstand where he'd see it first thing in the morning, right next to Natalie's favorite hair tie that he couldn't bring himself to put away. The purple elastic was stretched and faded now, but still held the shape of her ponytail. Exhaustion crept over him as he leaned back in his chair. The springs creaked softly in the quiet room. Closing his eyes, he felt the familiar wave of sadness wash through him, heavy and deep, like an old friend he never wanted but couldn't shake. The box of memories sat before him, a testament to both love and loss, as night settled fully around his home. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Clint's office as he dialed the hospice's number. His hand trembled slightly as he punched in each digit, and his heart beat faster with each ring until a friendly voice answered. "Good morning, Evergreen Hospice. How may I help you?" "This is Deputy Clint Walker. I'm trying to reach Nurse Marcia who worked there about 5 years ago." He gripped the phone tighter, hoping this lead would finally provide some answers. There was a pause on the line, longer than seemed natural. "Oh, Marcia is actually here, but not as staff anymore. She's a patient now." The words hit Clint like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. "What?" "She's in the terminal ward," the receptionist said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "Would you like to visit her?" "She's still accepting visitors." Later that afternoon, Clint walked through the familiar corridors of the hospice, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The mixed scent of antiseptic and lavender brought back memories of sitting by Natalie's bedside, holding her thin hand through endless nights. A nurse in pale blue scrubs led him to room 214, where Marcia lay propped up against white pillows, an IV line trailing from her arm. Despite her frail appearance and the oxygen tube beneath her nose, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Clint Walker," she said, her voice thin but warm. "I've thought about you often. So very often." Clint settled into the chair beside her bed, the plastic creaking under his weight. His throat felt tight as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. "Marcia, I need to ask you about this." Tears welled in her tired eyes as she looked at the silver band gleaming in the afternoon light. "Oh," she whispered. "I wondered when this day would come." "So it was Natalie's ring?" Marcia nodded slowly, her gray hair rustling against the pillow. "I kept little things from special patients, those who touched my heart deeply. Natalie was one of them. Her courage, her kindness even when she was suffering." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, I meant to return it to you, but after she passed, I just couldn't face you. The grief in your eyes was too much to bear. And Claire? Clint asked gently, leaning forward. How does she fit into this? She came to me about a year ago, scared and alone, just a child with adult worries in her eyes. She reminded me so much of Natalie, not in looks, but in spirit, that same inner strength. Marcia reached for Clint's hand with fingers that felt like delicate bird bones. I gave her the ring as a reminder that she wasn't alone, that there was still hope. Sometimes people need a physical reminder to hold on to. Clint felt tears burning behind his eyes as the pieces finally fell into place. All this time, the ring hadn't been stolen. It had been passed on as a gift of compassion, a torch of hope handed from one struggling soul to another. I know I should have asked you first, Marcia said, her breath coming in shallow waves. Can you forgive me? Before Clint could respond, she squeezed his hand with surprising strength. Please take care of Claire. That girl deserves a second chance at having someone believe in her, just like Natalie had you. I promise, Clint said softly, meaning it with all his heart. In that moment, he felt the weight of both past and future settling on his shoulders, and for once, it didn't feel like a burden. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Clint walked down the station hallway, his footsteps echoing against the worn linoleum floor. His mind was still processing everything Marcia had told him, each revelation hitting him like a physical weight. He stopped at the holding cell where Claire sat on the narrow bench, her shoulders tense and her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. You're free to go, he said, unlocking the cell door with a metallic click that seemed too loud in the quiet hallway. Claire's eyes narrowed with suspicion, her whole body coiled like a spring. Just like that? I spoke to Marcia at the hospice. She told me everything about the ring. Clint's voice softened, heavy with regret. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. Claire stood up slowly, keeping her distance as if expecting a trick. You locked me up without even trying to understand. Didn't even give me a chance to explain. You're right. Clint ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in every movement. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. It wasn't fair to you. Not at all. She gathered her belongings from the plastic bin on the desk, her movements careful and deliberate like a wounded animal ready to bolt. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Let me drive you back to the Thompsons, Clint offered, trying to bridge the growing gap between them. Claire hesitated, weighing her options before giving a slight nod. The walk to his patrol car was uncomfortable, each step measured and uncertain, the evening air doing little to ease the tension. Inside the car, Clint tried again. Marcia told me how she met you, about finding you that night. She helped me when no one else would, Claire replied flatly, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. Her reflection showed eyes too old for her young face. She's a special person. Clint glanced at Claire, noting how small she looked in the passenger seat. She was there for my daughter, too, at the end. I know. Claire's response was barely above a whisper, her breath fogging the window. The streets passed by in silence, broken only by the soft hum of tires on asphalt. Clint gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening as he searched for the right words. I understand if you're angry. You don't understand anything about me, Claire cut him off, her words sharp with hurt and disappointment. Clint nodded, accepting the rebuke. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence, the evening sky darkening to purple above them. When they pulled up to the Thompsons' house, Claire opened the door immediately, the interior light flooding the car. Without a word or backward glance, she stepped out of the car and walked away, leaving Clint alone with the engine idling and the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Thompsons' front porch as Clint knocked on their door, his knuckles hesitating slightly against the weathered wood. Martha opened it, her kind face showing a mix of surprise and concern, her gray hair neatly pinned back as always. Deputy Walker, please come in, she said, ushering him inside with a gentle wave of her hand. Harold sat in his worn armchair, nodding in greeting, the morning paper folded across his knee. "I wanted to apologize," Clint began, standing in their cozy living room, surrounded by family photos and well-loved furniture. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions about Claire." Martha's expression softened, the worry lines around her eyes easing. "We understand you were doing your job, but Claire, she's been through so much already, more than any child should have to bear." "She barely touched her dinner last night," Harold added, leaning forward, the chair creaking beneath him. "Just push the food around her plate. That's not like her at all. Usually cleans up everything and helps with the dishes, too." Martha settled into her chair, hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the morning light. "You know, just last week she helped Mrs. Peterson next door with her groceries without being asked. That sweet woman can barely manage those steps anymore. That's the kind of person Claire is." "She wants to be a social worker," Harold said proudly, his voice warming. "Talks about helping kids who've been through what she has. But sometimes—" He shook his head, his expression clouding. "Sometimes the past weighs heavy on her. We see it in the quiet moments." Claire appeared in the doorway then, freezing when she saw Clint. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed defensively. "Could we talk?" Clint asked gently, keeping his voice soft and unthreatening. After a moment's hesitation, Claire nodded. They stepped out onto the back porch, where morning glories climbed the trellis, their purple blooms reaching toward the sun. "I know saying sorry isn't enough," Clint began, "but I mean it. With everything I am." Claire wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection he'd seen too many times before. "Everyone always assumes the worst about me, like I'm just another problem to solve, another case file to close." "That's not," Clint started, his heart aching. "You don't know what it's like," she continued, her voice quiet but firm, each word carrying years of hurt. "Moving from house to house, never being good enough, always feeling like you're just taking up space, like you're borrowed time on someone else's life." Clint saw the pain in her eyes, so familiar yet different from Natalie's. This wasn't about a ring anymore. This was about a young woman who'd been failed by too many people, too many times. "The Thompsons say you want to be a social worker," he said softly, offering her a bridge back to safer ground. A small smile flickered across Claire's face like sunshine breaking through clouds. Someone needs to look out for those kids. Someone who understands. When Clint prepared to leave, Harold walked him to the door, his steps measured and deliberate. The older man's eyes were serious as he said, "She's a good kid, Sheriff. She just needs someone to believe in her. Someone who won't give up when things get rough." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Clint sat on his weathered porch steps, his coffee mug growing cold beside him. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it memories of evenings spent here with Natalie, watching the same sunset. His daughter had loved these quiet moments, often sharing her dreams of becoming a teacher, of making a difference in children's lives. She would sit right where his coffee mug was now, her legs swinging with endless energy. Now, thinking of Claire, Clint felt an ache in his chest that was all too familiar. Two young women, separated by time and circumstance, yet connected by a simple ring and their determination to overcome life's challenges. Where Natalie had been open and optimistic, Claire was guarded and defensive, but underneath, Clint sensed the same fierce spirit, the same burning desire to make things better. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you, sweetheart," he whispered to the fading light, his voice catching slightly. Inside his house, Clint pulled Natalie's photo album from the bookshelf where it had sat untouched for months. The leather cover was worn smooth from countless touches, its corners softened by years of handling. He settled into his recliner and opened it carefully, the familiar creak of its spine oddly comforting. There she was, beaming at the camera on her 16th birthday, wearing the ring that now belonged to Claire. Another photo showed her tutoring younger kids at the library, her face lit up with purpose as she helped a small boy sound out words. "You would have been an amazing teacher," he said softly, running his finger along the edge of the photo, remembering how she'd spend hours preparing simple lesson plans just for fun. Each page brought fresh memories, but instead of drowning in grief as he usually did, Clint felt something stirring inside him, determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could help shape Claire's future. Setting the album aside with newfound resolve, he grabbed a notepad and began writing, his pen moving with urgency. First, he listed educational resources, scholarships, tutoring programs, and counseling services that could make a real difference. The Thompsons were doing their best, but they could use support. Next, he wrote down local organizations that helped foster kids transition into adulthood, adding notes about specific programs that might appeal to Claire. His pen paused over Maria Delgado's name, tapping thoughtfully against the paper. As a former social worker turned police officer, she had connections throughout the community. More importantly, she had a heart for kids like Claire and the experience to back up her compassion. Clint moved to his desk and opened his laptop, the screen's glow filling the darkening room. The words flowed easily as he composed an email to Maria, explaining Claire's situation and his desire to help. He attached a list of the resources he'd identified, then added a personal note about why this mattered so much to him, sharing just enough about Natalie to help Maria understand. With a deep sigh, he hit send and leaned back in his chair, feeling both drained and energized. The weight of grief still pressed against his chest, but now it was joined by something else, purpose, and maybe even a glimmer of hope. The morning sun streamed through the station's windows as Clint walked in, his boots clicking against the worn linoleum floor. The usual morning chatter died down when he entered, replaced by meaningful glances and whispered conversations. Coffee cups paused midway to lips, and chairs swiveled in his direction. He could feel the weight of their stares as he made his way to his desk, the familiar route now feeling like a gauntlet. "Playing social worker now, Walker?" Hank Carver's voice carried across the room, dripping with sarcasm. His coffee-stained tie hung loose around his neck as he smirked. "Thought we were supposed to enforce the law, not babysit runaways." Clint's jaw tightened as he set down his coffee, the ceramic mug making a sharp sound against the desk surface. Other officers pretended to focus on their paperwork, shuffling papers and tapping keyboards with exaggerated concentration, but their ears were clearly tuned to the brewing confrontation. "You know these kids," Hank continued, leaning against a nearby desk and folding his arms across his chest, "especially ones like her. They'll just take advantage of your kindness. Seen it 100 times. They come in here with their sob stories, and next thing you know, they're right back on the streets." The implied racism in Hank's tone made Clint's blood boil, his hands clenching involuntarily beneath his desk. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. "What exactly do you mean by ones like her, Hank?" "Come on, you know what I mean. I'm just looking out for you here, buddy. No need to get all defensive about it." "No, you're not." Clint's voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of years of authority. "Our job is to serve and protect everyone in this community, not just the ones you approve of. Every single person deserves our help, Hank." Maria Delgado, working at a nearby desk, gave Clint a subtle nod of support as she straightened a stack of files with determined precision. "You're making this personal," Hank sneered, his face reddening. "Getting soft because she reminds you of—" "Don't!" Clint's warning cut through the air like a knife, the single word carrying enough force to make several officers flinch. Unknown to them, Claire sat in the reception area, catching fragments of their heated exchange through the thin walls. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap as words like "runaway" and "these kids" drifted through, each one striking like a small blow. Each snippet felt like a confirmation of her worst fears, that she was just another problem for people to solve, another burden to bear. The morning sunlight that had seemed warm and promising when she'd arrived now felt harsh and exposing. When Clint emerged from the office area, his face still tight with anger, he spotted Claire sitting stiffly in one of the plastic chairs. The Thompsons stood nearby, concern etched on their faces as they shifted uncomfortably. Claire's eyes met his briefly before sliding away, cold and distant, a wall already building between them. "Claire," he started, taking a step toward her, his voice softening with concern. She stood up abruptly, her chair rocking backward, shouldering past him without a word. The Thompsons followed, offering apologetic glances as they left the station, the glass door swinging shut behind them with a decisive click, leaving Clint standing alone in the harsh fluorescent light, the weight of the morning's confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. Claire sat on her bed at the Thompsons, twisting Natalie's ring around her finger. The words she'd overheard at the station echoed in her mind. Some runaway kid. Her chest felt tight as tears threatened to spill, and her throat burned with unshed emotion. She glanced around the small room that had been her safe haven for the past year. Martha's hand-stitched quilted blanket lay folded at the foot of her bed, its familiar patterns a reminder of countless nights spent feeling warm and protected. Harold's woodworking tools hummed from the garage below, their steady rhythm usually comforting, but now just another reminder of what she was about to leave behind. But now everything felt temporary, just like every other place she'd called home. Taking a deep breath, Claire pulled her worn backpack from under the bed and began stuffing it with clothes and essentials. Her hands trembled as she packed, but her mind was made up. She couldn't bear to hear anyone else dismiss her as just another troubled teen. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Claire, honey, I made your favorite chocolate chip cookies," Martha called through the door, her voice warm with motherly concern. "Thanks, Martha. I'm just tired. Going to bed early," Claire answered, forcing her voice to sound normal despite the lump in her throat. "All right, dear, sleep well." Claire waited until the house grew quiet, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house settling for the night. The digital clock on her nightstand read 11:43 p.m. when she finally grabbed her backpack. She pulled out a piece of paper and wrote with shaking fingers, "Dear Martha and Harold, thank you for everything you've done for me. You're the closest thing to real parents I've ever had. But I can't stay. I need to figure things out on my own. Please don't worry about me. Love, Claire." Her tears smudged the ink as she placed the note on her pillow. Moving silently through the darkened house, Claire paused at the front door, taking one last look at the family photos on the wall, including a recent one of her with the Thompsons at Christmas, her smile genuine and bright in a way she hadn't known was possible before them. The night air was cool as she slipped outside, carrying the scent of spring flowers from Martha's garden. She walked quickly down the street, not looking back, clutching her backpack tight against her chest like a shield against the world. The next morning, Harold's hand shook as he dialed Clint's number at the station. "Sheriff Walker? Claire's gone. She left sometime in the night. There's a note." His voice cracked with worry and heartbreak. Clint felt his stomach drop. "I'll be right there," he said, already grabbing his keys. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. If he'd handled things differently at the station yesterday, if he'd seen the signs, if he'd protected her better. Minutes later, Clint stood in the station parking lot, reading Claire's note in the early morning light. The paper trembled in his hands as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a beautiful dawn that felt like a mockery of his failure. He had to find her. He wouldn't fail another child who needed him. Not again. Clint gripped his steering wheel tightly as he cruised through the quiet streets of town. The morning sun cast long shadows across empty sidewalks and closed storefronts, painting everything in shades of gold and gray. His police radio crackled with routine updates, but none mentioned Claire. Each passing minute made his chest tighter with worry. "Dispatch, this is Walker. Any word from the South Side shelters?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. His fingers drummed against the wheel as he waited for a response. "Negative, deputy. No sign of her yet." He pulled up to Hope House, the largest shelter in town. The brick building looked worn but welcoming, with cheerful flower pots lining the entrance, their bright blooms a stark contrast to the weathered facade. Inside, the staff greeted him with concerned faces, the morning shift already busy with breakfast preparations. "We'll keep an eye out, Deputy Walker," said Maria, the shelter coordinator, studying the photo he showed her. Her eyes softened with recognition of the situation. "Poor thing, they always think they're better off alone. I've seen it too many times." Back in his patrol car, Clint checked 3 more shelters. Each stop left him more frustrated and anxious, the weight of failure growing heavier with every dead end. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He spotted Lou's diner near the bus station and pulled in, hoping to grab a quick coffee and maybe a lead. "Yeah, I remember her," said Jenny, the waitress, adjusting her name tag as she leaned against the counter. "Dark-skinned girl, real quiet. Sat in that corner booth last night. She pointed to a window seat where the morning sun now streamed through smudged glass. Kept checking her phone and looking over her shoulder. Ordered just a hot chocolate. Barely touched it, poor kid. Clint's heart jumped. What time was this? Around midnight. Looked like she was waiting for something. Probably the late bus. She kept watching the schedule board across the street. As Clint drove toward the bus station, memories of Natalie flooded back, sharp and painful. The day she got sick. The hospital rooms with their antiseptic smell. All the times he thought, if only he'd noticed the symptoms sooner. If only he'd been a better father, if only he'd trusted his instincts. Not this time, he muttered, pulling into the station parking lot, his jaw set with determination. I won't fail another kid. Not again. The weight of Natalie's photo pressed against his chest from his shirt pocket, a constant reminder of what was at stake. He sat for a moment, gathering his strength, his hand still gripping the wheel, before scanning the nearly empty parking lot for any sign of Claire. A few early morning travelers shuffled about with their luggage, but no sign of the teenager he desperately needed to find. Clint's heart skipped a beat when he spotted Claire on the metal bench near the bus station. Her shoulders were hunched, and she gripped her backpack like it was a shield, her knuckles white against the worn fabric. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete as she studied the schedule board with intense focus, her foot tapping nervously against the ground. Claire, he called softly, approaching with measured steps, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable. She whirled around, her body tensing like a coiled spring. "Leave me alone," she snapped, but her voice wavered, betraying the hurt beneath her anger. "I know you're angry," Clint said, keeping his distance. "And you have every right to be, every single right. You're just here because you feel guilty," Claire shot back, her eyes glistening in the early morning light. "Because I remind you of her. That's all this is. That's all I am to you. Just some replacement." Clint felt the truth of her words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He took a deep breath and sat on the bench opposite her, the cold metal seeping through his uniform pants. "You're partly right," he admitted, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "When I first saw you, all I could think about was Natalie. But that's not why I'm here now. Not anymore." "Then why?" Claire demanded, her voice cracking like thin ice. "Why do you even care? Nobody else ever has." "Because I failed Natalie," Clint said quietly, his own eyes growing moist with unshed tears. "I wasn't there when she needed me most. I was always working, always telling myself I'd make it up to her later. But later never came." He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. "When I see you, Claire, I don't just see my mistakes. I see someone brave and strong who deserves better than what life's given her. Someone who reminds me every day what courage looks like." Claire's grip on her backpack loosened slightly, her shoulders dropping a fraction. "You don't know anything about me. Not really." "I know you want to be a social worker," Clint said gently, leaning forward slightly. "I know you care about helping other kids who've been through what you have. And I know you're scared to trust anyone because everyone's let you down. I understand that fear better than you might think." A tear rolled down Claire's cheek, catching the sunlight before falling. "I can't stay somewhere I'm not wanted. I won't do that again." "You are wanted," Clint insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "The Thompsons love you. And I—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, knowing their weight. "I want to help you, not because of Natalie, but because of who you are, because you deserve that chance." Claire wiped her eyes with her sleeve, looking uncertain, hope and fear warring on her face. "I don't know if I can trust that." "Trust you." "I understand," Clint said, nodding slowly. "How about we start small? Just come back with me and we'll figure things out together. Take all the time you need to decide what you want. No pressure, no expectations." Claire studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, before giving a slight nod. They stood together, walking away from the bus station in silence, each step heavy with unspoken emotions and fragile possibilities. The morning sun sparkled on the lake's surface as Clint and Claire sat on the weathered wooden bench. A gentle breeze rustled through the maple trees, carrying the sweet scent of spring flowers and fresh grass. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, her posture tense but less guarded than before. The old bench creaked beneath them, worn smooth by years of visitors seeking solace by the water. Natalie loved this spot, Clint said softly, his eyes fixed on the water. She'd come here to grade papers or just think. Said the ducks were better listeners than most people. His voice carried a warmth that only appeared when he spoke of his daughter. A hint of a smile crossed Claire's face, softening her usually stern expression. She was a teacher? Almost. Clint's voice grew thick with emotion, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She was studying to become one. Had such a way with kids. Could get through to even the most troubled ones. He pulled out his wallet and showed Claire a worn photo of Natalie surrounded by children at a summer camp, their faces bright with laughter. She volunteered here every summer. Those kids adored her. Claire studied the photo, her fingers tracing its edges with unusual gentleness. She looks really happy, like she belonged here. She was. Even when things got tough with her illness, she'd find reasons to smile. Clint tucked the photo away carefully, as if handling a precious treasure. Sometimes I think that's what I miss most, her ability to see the good in everything no matter how dark things seemed. Claire shifted on the bench, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, her shoulders hunched slightly. I used to be like that, she said quietly. Before the foster homes? Clint prompted gently, turning slightly to face her. Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes despite her obvious effort to hold them back. The last one was the worst. They'd lock us in our rooms without food if we misbehaved, which meant anything from talking too loud to asking for help with homework. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. Nobody believed us when we tried to tell them. Not the teachers, not the social workers. Nobody. Clint's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening with barely contained anger. I'm so sorry, Claire. You deserved better than that. Every child does. That's why I ran, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, words tumbling out like long-held secrets. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Still can't most days. It's safer that way. I know I haven't given you much reason to trust me, Clint admitted, his expression full of regret. I let my own pain cloud my judgment. But I want to do better, not because you remind me of Natalie, but because you deserve someone in your corner. Everyone does. Claire looked at him directly for the first time that morning, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. How do I know you won't give up on me too? Everyone else has. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, Clint said honestly, meeting her gaze steadily. But I can promise I'll keep trying, every single day, to be someone you can count on. That's what matters. Showing up even when it's hard. They sat in silence for a while, watching a family of ducks glide across the lake's mirror-like surface. The little ones followed their mother in a perfect line, safe and secure. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice small but steady. Thank you, she said softly, for telling me about Natalie, for sharing this place with me. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows as Clint sat across from Maria Delgado, spreading custody paperwork across their small table. Steam rose from their untouched coffee cups, while Maria examined the forms with careful eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration as she flipped through page after page. It won't be easy, Maria said, tapping her pen against a particularly complex document. Single guardianship applications face extra scrutiny, especially with your work schedule. The review board can be incredibly thorough. Clint rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the weight of sleepless nights. I know, but I have to try. Claire needs stability. She deserves a real home. I'm not discouraging you, Maria smiled warmly, reaching across to pat his hand. Just preparing you for the battle ahead. These forms are just the beginning. There will be home studies, interviews, background checks. Throughout the day, Clint's phone barely left his ear as he called one government office after another, his voice growing hoarse from repeated explanations. Each conversation led to more questions, more forms, more requirements. His desk became buried under a mountain of paperwork, sticky notes dotting the edges of documents with reminders and follow-up tasks. "I'm sorry, Deputy Walker," a social services representative said, her voice crackling through the phone. "But given Claire's history of running away, we need extensive documentation of your ability to provide proper supervision. We'll need reference letters, financial statements, and a detailed care plan." "I understand," Clint replied, jotting down yet another list of required documents, his hand cramping from hours of writing. "Whatever it takes. Just tell me what you need." Meanwhile, at the Thompsons' house, Claire sat at their kitchen table, picking at a plate of Martha's homemade chocolate chip cookies, the sweet aroma filling the warm kitchen. Harold settled into the chair beside her, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he watched her thoughtfully. "You know, dear," Martha said, joining them with a pot of tea and 3 mismatched cups. "What Clint's trying to do, it takes real dedication. Not everyone would go to such lengths." Claire stared at her half-eaten cookie, crumbs scattered on the floured plate. "I guess." "He's been at the station since dawn," Harold added gently, stirring sugar into his tea. "Filing papers, making calls. Maria says he hasn't even stopped for lunch. That man is determined." Claire's expression softened slightly, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "He doesn't have to do all that." "No," Martha agreed, patting Claire's hand with motherly affection. "He doesn't have to. He wants to. That's what makes it special." Back at his desk, Clint sorted through another stack of forms, his coffee long, cold, and forgotten. The setting sun cast long shadows across his office as he filled out detailed explanations of his income, living situation, and support system, his handwriting growing messier with fatigue. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "You're doing the right thing. Keep going. She's worth it." Clint smiled despite his exhaustion and picked up his pen again, determination renewed in every stroke. The hospice hallway stretched before them, its walls painted in soft, calming colors that seemed to whisper peace. Clint glanced at Claire, who walked beside him with uncertain steps, her fingers wrapped tightly around her backpack straps like a lifeline. The antiseptic smell brought back memories of Natalie's final days, making his chest tighten with a familiar ache that never quite went away. "Room 215, Clint said softly, pausing at the doorway. His hand hovered near the frame, steadying himself for what lay ahead. Inside, Marcia lay propped up against white pillows, looking frailer than during Clint's last visit, her skin nearly as pale as the sheets around her. But her eyes lit up when she saw them, and her smile carried the same warmth he remembered from years ago, brightening her whole face. "Claire, sweetheart." Marcia's voice was thin but filled with joy, like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Come closer, let me see you." Claire hesitated, shifting from foot to foot, then moved to Marcia's bedside. The older woman reached out and took her hand, her papery skin gentle against Claire's younger fingers. "You look stronger," Marcia said, studying Claire's face with knowing eyes. "More sure of yourself." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, catching the fluorescent light. "I missed you." Clint stood back, watching the tender exchange, feeling like an observer in a sacred moment. His throat felt tight as he remembered how Marcia had cared for Natalie, showing the same gentleness she now showed Claire, that same maternal instinct that seemed to flow from her very being. "Marcia," he finally spoke, moving closer to the bed, "I need to thank you for everything, for being there for Natalie, and for helping Claire when she needed it most." Marcia squeezed Claire's hand, her thin fingers surprisingly strong. "You know, Claire reminds me so much of Natalie. Not in looks, but in spirit. That same determination to help others, despite her own struggles. That light inside that nothing can dim." Claire wiped her eyes with her free hand, her shoulders trembling slightly. "Tell me more about Natalie?" "Oh, she was special," Marcia said, her voice growing stronger with the memories, as if they gave her renewed energy. "Even here, sick as she was, she'd ask about other patients. She'd make cards for the children's ward, decorating them with little drawings and jokes. Just like you, Claire, always thinking of others, even when times are hardest." Clint couldn't hold back his own tears now. They slid silently down his cheeks as he remembered finding those handmade cards in Natalie's room after she passed, each one a testament to her generous heart. "Claire," Marcia continued, her gaze intense despite her weakness, "Clint has that same heart, the same protective instinct, the same desire to help. Trust in that. Let him be there for you, like he was for Natalie. Some people are meant to find each other." The room fell quiet except for soft sniffles and the distant hum of hospital equipment. Claire's shoulders shook as she cried, and Clint placed a gentle hand on her back, offering silent support. When it was time to leave, Marcia held on to Clint's hand. Her grip was weak but insistent as she whispered, her words carrying the weight of a final request. "Take care of her, Clint. She's special, just like Natalie was." Clint nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his heart as they walked out into the gray afternoon, where clouds hung low and heavy with unshed rain. Clint's phone rang early the next morning, casting a harsh glow in his dimly lit office. The screen's blue light made shadows dance across his tired face. When he saw the hospice's number, his heart sank. The nurse's gentle voice confirmed his fears. Marcia had passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the quiet dignity she'd shown throughout her life. He sat at his desk staring at the photo of Natalie, his fingers drumming nervously as he dialed Claire's number. The morning sun was barely peeking through his window blinds. Her sleepy "hello" made him pause, his throat tightening with the weight of what he had to say. "Claire, I've got some news," he said softly. "It's about Marcia." The silence on the other end felt heavy, filled with unspoken understanding. "Oh," Claire whispered, understanding immediately. He could hear her shaky breath through the phone. 3 days later, they stood together under a gray sky at Mountain View Cemetery. The funeral was small, just a handful of hospice staff, former patients, and their families. White roses decorated the simple casket, their petals dancing in the gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut grass and morning dew. Claire wore a black dress borrowed from Martha Thompson, her fingers wrapped tightly around the ring as if it were an anchor in a storm. Clint noticed how she hadn't let go of it since they arrived, occasionally running her thumb across its smooth surface. The chaplain spoke about Marcia's dedication to her patients, but Clint's thoughts drifted to deeper truths, how one person's kindness could change so many lives, rippling outward like stones thrown in still water. He thought about Natalie's final days, made bearable by Marcia's gentle care and unwavering compassion. And now Claire, standing beside him, living proof of Marcia's lasting impact and the power of believing in someone. Claire stepped forward to place a single rose on the casket. Her hand lingered there for a moment as she closed her eyes, the ring catching the dim sunlight through the clouds. Clint watched her lips move in silent prayer or promise. He couldn't tell which. Her shoulders trembled slightly with emotion. After the ceremony, as others drifted away in quiet conversation, Claire remained rooted in place, her eyes fixed on the fresh earth. Finally, she looked up at Clint, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with unshed tears. "She really believed in me, didn't she?" Clint nodded, meeting her gaze with the same steadfast certainty Marcia had always shown. "So do I." The afternoon sun streamed through the Thompsons' kitchen windows as Clint and Claire sat at the wooden table, surrounded by college brochures and financial aid forms. Martha had set out cookies and lemonade, the sweet smell mixing with the fresh spring air coming through the screen door. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the garden outside. "So," Clint said, spreading out several pamphlets, his fingers carefully arranging them in a neat row. "What interests you most about social work?" Claire fidgeted with her pencil, rolling it between her fingers, then straightened up. "I want to help kids like me," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "The ones who think nobody cares." Clint nodded encouragingly, his eyes warm with understanding. "That's a worthy goal, and with your experience, you'd understand what they're going through better than most." The next day, Maria Delgado arrived with a stack of documents and a warm smile that lit up her entire face. "I've got good news," she announced, sitting down at the table and smoothing her skirt. "There are several scholarships specifically for foster youth. Your grades are solid, Claire, and your personal story would make a compelling application." Claire's eyes widened, hope flickering across her face. "Really? I always thought college was just impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Maria replied, sorting through the papers with practiced efficiency. "Look here. This foundation covers full tuition for foster youth pursuing careers in social services. They're looking for exactly someone like you." Harold Thompson, who had been quietly watching from his worn leather armchair, spoke up. "You've got a home here as long as you need, Claire. Martha and I want to see you succeed. We mean that with all our hearts." Martha squeezed Claire's shoulder as she refilled their glasses, ice cubes clinking softly. "We're not going anywhere, dear. This is your home now, too." Over the next few days, Claire threw herself into research and applications with fierce determination. The dining room table became command central, covered with drafts of personal statements and requirement checklists. Coffee rings marked late-night editing sessions. Clint stopped by every evening after his shift, still in uniform, reviewing her work and offering suggestions. "What about this part?" Claire asked, pointing to an essay question. Her forehead creased with worry. "They want to know about overcoming challenges." "Just be honest," Clint advised, leaning back in his chair. "Your strength shows in how you've handled everything. Let them see the real you." Finally, Claire sat back and looked at her completed first application. Her hand hovered over the submit button on the laptop, trembling slightly. She glanced at Clint, who gave her a proud nod, his eyes misty with emotion. "You've got this," he said softly. "You've got this all the way." The community center buzzed with energy as people filed in, taking seats in the rows of chairs facing the small stage. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh-baked cookies wafted from the refreshment table at the back. Clint adjusted his tie nervously, while Claire organized her note cards at the podium, her fingers smoothing each corner with careful precision. The familiar faces of neighbors mixed with local business owners and social workers, all curious about this new initiative. Some carried notebooks, ready to take notes. Clint stepped up to the microphone first, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The microphone squeaked slightly as he adjusted it. "5 years ago, my daughter Natalie taught me what true compassion looks like," he began. "Even during her illness, she never stopped thinking about others." He paused, collecting himself, his hand gripping the podium's edge. "Today, we want to continue her legacy." The audience listened intently as Clint explained their vision for mentoring at-risk youth and providing resources for foster children. Several people nodded along, their expressions softening with understanding. When Claire took the stage, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice rang clear and strong, carrying to the very back of the room. "I spent years feeling invisible in the foster system," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd with newfound confidence. "But one person who believed in me changed everything." She touched the ring on her finger, twisting it gently as she spoke. "That's all it takes sometimes. Just one person who cares." Hands shot up across the room as Claire finished speaking, like eager students in a classroom. Local business owners pledged donations, teachers offered tutoring services, and families volunteered to host gatherings. Harold and Martha Thompson stood up from their seats in the front row, Harold's voice warm and firm. "Our home is always open for meetings," Martha added, smiling at Claire, her eyes crinkling with motherly warmth. "We've seen firsthand how much difference a support system can make." The energy in the room was electric as people formed groups, exchanging contact information and discussing ideas. The soft murmur of voices filled the space with hope and possibility. Social workers connected with potential mentors, while local officials promised to expedite permits for future events. Someone started a sign-up sheet that quickly filled with names and phone numbers. As the crowd mingled, Clint and Claire stood side by side at the edge of the stage, watching their vision take shape before their eyes. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. A gentle breeze from the air conditioning rustled the papers on the sign-up table. "Natalie would be proud of us," Clint whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached over and gave Claire's shoulder a gentle squeeze. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in, finding their seats among the rows of folding chairs. The air was thick with perfume, pride, and the rustle of graduation programs. Clint fidgeted with his tie, sitting between the Thompsons and Maria. His eyes scanned the sea of graduating seniors in their royal blue caps and gowns, searching for Claire. The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, making the tassels gleam. "There she is," Martha whispered, pointing to the middle section where Claire sat straight-backed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her cap was perfectly straight, just as Martha had helped her adjust it earlier that morning. The principal's welcome speech seemed to stretch on forever as Clint watched Claire. He could see her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths, trying to calm her nerves. Every now and then, she'd glance back toward their section, seeking reassurance. Harold reached over and patted Clint's shoulder, understanding the emotion of the moment. Finally, the names began. "Claire Robinson," the principal called out. Clint jumped to his feet, clapping and cheering. The Thompsons and Maria joined him, their voices carrying across the auditorium. Claire's face broke into a radiant smile as she crossed the stage, her steps confident and sure. She accepted her diploma with grace, pausing for a photo before returning to her seat. The gold honor cords around her neck sparkled under the lights. After the ceremony, families spilled into the courtyard, their chatter and laughter filling the warm spring air. Claire found them near a blooming cherry tree, still clutching her diploma. Pink petals drifted down around them like confetti. Clint pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. "I have something for you," he said softly. Claire opened the box to reveal a delicate silver locket, its surface catching the sunlight. Inside was a photo of Natalie, her smile bright and kind, forever frozen in time. Claire's fingers traced the smooth surface of the locket, tears welling in her eyes. "Clint, she started, then took a deep breath. Her voice quivered with emotion. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere, like I have a real family." Clint pulled her into a tight hug, his own eyes glistening. The Thompsons and Maria gathered around them, creating a circle of love and support. A gentle breeze carried more cherry blossoms around them. Claire wiped her eyes, looking at each face that had become so dear to her. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, gesturing to the group around her. "People who believe in me, who want me to succeed, who love me for who I am." Clint squeezed her shoulder gently. "This is just the beginning. You've got a bright future ahead of you, and we'll be right here cheering you on, every step of the way." The small bell above the jeweler's door chimed as Clint and Claire stepped inside. Warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the display windows, making the glass cases sparkle with countless diamonds and precious stones. Claire held Natalie's ring carefully in her palm as they approached the polished wooden counter, her fingers protectively cupped around the precious memento. "We'd like to have this ring engraved," Clint explained to the elderly jeweler, who adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses to examine the piece. His experienced hands gently took the ring, turning it in the light. Claire cleared her throat, her voice carrying a mix of hesitation and hope. "I was thinking, maybe we could add both sets of initials, Natalie's and mine." She glanced uncertainly at Clint, her heart beating faster, "to show how we're connected now." Clint's eyes softened, crinkling at the corners with emotion. "I think that's perfect." While the jeweler worked in his back room, Clint and Claire sat in the waiting area. The familiar leather chairs creaked as they settled in, the worn cushions speaking of years of similar conversations between families. "You know," Clint said, his voice quiet and reflective, "Natalie would have loved you. She had this way of seeing the good in everyone, just like you do. Couldn't help but find the bright side of things." Claire smiled, twisting her graduation tassel between her fingers, the blue and gold threads catching the light. "Tell me more about her?" "She wanted to be a teacher," Clint said, leaning back, lost in memories. "Said every kid deserved someone in their corner. Even when she was sick, she'd make cards for the other kids in the hospital, decorated them with little drawings and encouraging messages. That's why Marcia kept her ring," Claire realized, the pieces falling into place. She saw that same spirit. The jeweler called them back to the counter, presenting the newly engraved ring with a flourish. The initials NW and CR flowed together in elegant script, catching the light as Claire turned it in her hands. With trembling fingers, she slipped it onto her finger where it fit as if it had always belonged there. "It's perfect, thank you," Claire said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It belongs with you," Clint replied, smiling warmly, his eyes glistening with pride and remembrance. The community center buzzed with excitement as people filtered in through the freshly painted double doors. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the packed room where metal folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing the stage. Colorful posters decorated the cream-colored walls, displaying information about youth programs, support services, and success stories of local teens who'd found their way. Clint adjusted his navy blue tie nervously as he stood at the wooden podium, his fingers drumming lightly against its surface. Claire squeezed his arm reassuringly, her newly engraved ring catching the morning light and sending tiny sparkles across the stage. The diverse crowd of families, social workers, and community members settled into a respectful silence as Clint cleared his throat. "5 years ago, I lost my daughter Natalie," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion swimming in his eyes. "She had a gift for seeing the best in people, for reaching out to those who needed help the most. Today, we honor her spirit by creating a space where every child can find hope, support, and the chance to build a better future." As Clint spoke about Natalie's compassion and her cherished dreams of becoming a teacher, many in the audience dabbed at their eyes with tissues. When he finished his heartfelt speech, Claire stepped up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly but her voice clear and strong against the quiet room. "A year ago, I was running away from everything and everyone," she said, meeting the eyes of several teenagers in the crowd. "I didn't trust anyone, didn't believe I deserved better. But sometimes hope finds you in unexpected ways." She touched the ring on her finger, drawing strength from its familiar presence. "Through Natalie's story and through Clint's kindness, I found more than just help. I found family and a future worth fighting for." Throughout the sunny afternoon, the community center hummed with positive energy and activity. Dedicated volunteers staffed information booths, while trained mentors met with potential mentees, sharing stories and building connections. Claire moved confidently between groups of teenagers, sharing her experiences and listening to their stories with genuine interest. Her eyes lit up with purpose as she helped younger kids find the right resources, showing them through her own example that change was possible. "See that girl over there?" One mother in a floral dress whispered to another, watching Claire guide a shy teenager with hunched shoulders toward the education support booth. "She's proof that these programs work. Real, living proof." As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows through the windows, Clint watched Claire surrounded by an eager group of kids. They hung on her every word as she spoke, her hands moving animatedly while she described her plans to become a social worker. The sight filled his chest with pride and gratitude, healing old wounds he'd thought would never close. "We did it, Natalie," he whispered softly to himself, watching his new daughter inspire hope in others just as Natalie once had, her spirit living on through this new chapter of their lives. The community center hummed with warm conversation as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished floor. Balloons in soft blues and silvers decorated the walls and floated near the ceiling, celebrating 1 year of changing young lives through the mentorship program. Claire stood near the refreshment table, her college acceptance letter tucked safely in her bag like a precious treasure, greeting the steady stream of well-wishers with a confidence she never knew she possessed. Clint watched from across the room, his heart full of pride and a deep sense of contentment. The past year had transformed both their lives in ways he never expected, healing old wounds and creating new bonds. The Thompsons sat nearby at one of the round tables, Martha dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, while Harold patted her hand gently, both of them beaming like proud parents. When Claire stepped up to the wooden podium, the room fell quiet, all eyes turning toward her. She adjusted the microphone with slightly trembling fingers, her ring, now bearing both sets of initials, glinting under the fluorescent lights like a beacon of hope. "A year ago I was lost," Claire began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the packed room. I was running away from everything and everyone, thinking I had to face the world alone. But sometimes the things we run from lead us exactly where we need to be. She glanced at Clint, who gave her an encouraging nod, his eyes shining with emotion. Deputy Walker could have just written me a ticket that day on the highway. Instead, he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, something worth saving. Claire's voice wavered slightly, thick with emotion. And the Thompsons opened their home and their hearts when I needed it most, showing me what a real family feels like. She spoke passionately about her upcoming college plans and her determination to become a social worker, to make a difference in other children's lives. Every kid deserves someone who believes in them, she said, her words ringing with conviction. That's what this program is about. That's what all of you have given me. A chance to believe in myself. Clint felt tears welling up in his eyes, and for once he didn't try to hide them. The weight of grief he'd carried for so long had lightened, transformed into something new. Hope, purpose, love. Helping Claire hadn't just saved her. It had saved him too, giving him back the sense of purpose he'd lost with Natalie. As Claire concluded her speech, the room erupted in thunderous applause. She made her way through the crowd of admirers to where Clint stood, her face glowing with accomplishment. The proud smile on his face said everything words couldn't express. "I'm so proud of you, kid," Clint said, his voice rough with emotion as he pulled her into a warm hug. Claire squeezed him tight and whispered back, her voice full of gratitude, "You're the reason I got here. You're the one who showed me the way." The spring breeze rustled through the ancient oak trees, scattering delicate pink cherry blossoms across the peaceful cemetery. Clint and Claire walked slowly between the neat rows of headstones, their footsteps crunching softly on the well-worn gravel path. In Claire's trembling hands, she carried a bouquet of pristine white lilies, Natalie's favorite flowers, each petal perfect and pure. The re-engraved ring hung on a delicate silver chain around her neck, catching brilliant glimpses of morning sunlight as they walked. They stopped at Natalie's grave, its smooth marble surface clean and well-tended, free from the leaves and debris that sometimes collected there. Clint took a deep, shaky breath, steadying himself as precious memories washed over him like gentle waves. Claire stood quietly beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm, giving him the moment he needed to collect himself. "Hey, sweetheart," Clint said softly, kneeling to arrange the lilies carefully against the headstone. His weathered fingers traced the deeply carved letters of Natalie's name with familiar tenderness. "I need to thank you for something." His voice cracked slightly, heavy with emotion. "You led me to Claire. Maybe you knew all along that we'd need each other, that we'd help each other heal." Claire knelt beside him in the dewy grass, carefully removing the ring from its delicate chain. With gentle reverence, she placed it on top of the headstone, where it gleamed brilliantly against the pristine marble surface. "I never got to meet you," Claire whispered, her dark eyes filling with tears that threatened to spill over. "But I feel like I know you through your dad's stories and the way he loves you." She touched the ring softly, reverently. "I promise to carry your spirit with me always. Every kid I help, every life I touch, it'll be because of you. Because you showed your dad how to open his heart again, and he showed me how to trust and believe in people again." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to sparrows and cardinals singing sweetly in the nearby trees. The morning sun warmed their faces as they shared this precious moment of quiet reflection. Clint felt years of crushing guilt and overwhelming grief slowly lifting from his shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of peace and purpose. Claire reached over and squeezed his rough hand in her smooth one. In that simple gesture was everything they'd become to each other: family, healing, hope for the future ahead. Rising slowly to their feet, they took one last lingering look at Natalie's grave. The ring and fresh flowers seemed to glow with an almost magical quality in the golden morning light, a perfect tribute to the daughter whose beautiful legacy had brought them together in ways they never could have imagined. As they walked hand in hand toward the black iron cemetery gate, Claire looked up at Clint with eyes full of gratitude and said softly, "Thank you for finding me when I was so lost." Clint smiled down at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he replied with complete sincerity, "No, thank you for saving me when I didn't even know I needed saving." If you enjoyed the story of Clint, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.